Thank you for joining me. I'm Nola Simon, the host of the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. And today I'd like to talk about how hybrid remote is actually perceived. Is it a policy? Is it a process? Is it a strategy? Or is it actually a part of organizational design? And I'm going to give you my opinion that it's actually all of them. And it has to work at all different levels throughout the organization. Every business works on the business and in the business. On the business would be accounting, HR, things that are not necessarily external to the business. So sales and customer service and frontline staff in various different functions could be considered to be working in the business because they're dealing with clients directly. Executives work for frontward facing, but with sponsors and board members and whatever that looks like for your particular business, right? So there's that balance of in the business and on the business that solopreneurs go through, but also so do enterprises. And how the work is done, when the work is done, where the work is done, that's all strategy and organizational design. So it's a combination of all of it. And some of it is regulatory. So it's not just decisions that you have to make. It's based on your business. What do you have to comply with? Because that's what your industry demands. That's what the regulators demand. So it's part of what are the immovable structures that you have to comply with and how do you design it around it. A lot of times I visualize this honestly as a garden. So in my spare time, I like designing gardens, mainly my own. And so if you think about a garden, you've got the boundaries of the property are your immovable objects. You can't grow things on property that's not yours. So do you have a fence to mark your borders? And then do you layer things that are immovable as well? So think of trees and bushes and perennial plants that come back year after year. So you want to actually design in such a way that where your permanent features are, and then you layer upon that. So this is where if you're moving back into what your organization looks like, your immovable objects, your trees and your bushes and all of that stuff, that's all your immovable policies that you're not going to change often because you can't or because you don't want to. And then strategy is what you want your garden to really look like, or your organization, whichever metaphor you're going with right now. And that's, do you just want to have a mix of perennials and annuals? So every year you're planting new flowers. Or do you actually want to diversify what you're planting? So you could put in the perennials, but you also then mix it with annuals and you've got bulbs. So like tulips and daffodils and that sort of bulbs. Or you could even branch out to more delicate things like dahlias, which are bulbs, but they have to be dug up every year, depending on where you live. And of course, that's another thing that's going to impact you is what is the environment that you operate in? Because a garden in Canada, I'm zone 5, looks very different to a garden in Georgia in the US or in Australia because they have plants that we don't have in Canada. The environment, the location, all of that is relevant because it's going to affect the things that are immovable and the choices that you make in terms of strategy, right? Seasonality also makes a difference as well. In Canada, where I am, we have 4 seasons, but you may live in a climate where it's really hot the majority of the year, and you don't have seasons the way that I have seasons in Canada. So again, think about your organization and the type of work you do. What is the seasonality that affects the things that are immovable? And what options does that give you to layer in strategy, process, and procedure and policies that give you more flexibility or less flexibility? Somebody I heard talk said that basically if you are concentrating on policy and procedure when it comes to hybrid remote, you're really focusing on compliance. Are you complying with the policy to be in the office 3 days a week? Yes or no? You're managing badge swipes, you're monitoring. if you are actually considering it as a strategy, then you move away from that compliance aspect, except when it gets to the design aspects, right? The immovable objects. So where do you want your focus to be? Do you want your focus to be on compliance to policy? Or do you want to give your people authority and autonomy and the agency to really decide when and where they work? And a lot of this is also related to the type of work you do, of course. But does each person know really the factors that go into making those decisions? How does it affect their job? How does their job affect the bottom line? How does that fuel the success of the company? And so you really have to cycle through all of those thought processes and move forwards and backwards from the organizational design, the strategy, the process, the procedures, the policies, and understand what that looks like from the top, but also from the bottom. How do you layer that into the organization so that your different departments and different people are working together? You have to understand the organizational structure and how people report to everyone, how power works throughout the organization, who reports to whom, who has authority to spend money, who can make decisions to fund projects, who has no authority whatsoever to do with money. And that can actually look different in terms of whether it's operational transactions or if it's actually real budget spend. So as an example for that, I worked with a team where we had VPs and directors who could approve transactions in the millions of dollars because it was actually transactions that had to be done to actually make the business work. But when I was on leave and I came back and I actually needed a additional headpiece for my chair because I had neck issues, even though it was all approved by doctors, it was all approved by the ergonomics team, it was part of my back to work sign off that had already been approved and reviewed. Nobody could actually approve it because it cost $800 and nobody had the budget spend to be able to spend and approve $800 except for this VP who was on vacation for 3 weeks. And it couldn't be escalated. That functionality couldn't be delegated to anybody else in her absence. So she might have been a VP capable of approving $50 million worth of transactions, but she could only approve $800. And nobody under her, so the director, the senior managers, the manager, nobody, even in the ergonomics team, could approve it. So her power really was related to $800 of real budget spend, not transactional spend. So that's span of power. How does that look? And does working either hybrid remote, does that fuel or create issues, right? So does working outside of an office fuel the business or impede the business, and in what ways, and at what levels, or what particular functions are impacted, and how do you work around that? So that's what I'd like you to consider. You may not be a garden aficionado, so I'm not sure if that metaphor works for you, but I'd love to hear if you have different metaphors that you consider or think of when you're talking about redesigning work for flexibility and something that's future focused, that has those same sort of elements in a way that you could actually develop a mental model for that. Because for me, the garden works, but I'm interested in hearing if there are other metaphors that people like to use. So that's my take on organizational design and hybrid remote. And as always, it's a pleasure. Thanks for listening.